title of this panel discussion is how to create tax-efficient income in retirement. So, Devin, we're talking about tax-efficient portfolios, but we also have to have an effective portfolio. So are there trade-offs an investor has to make when designing those two things, which might not always be consistent?
I think there's a lot of trade-offs, and I think it was Jamie earlier in one of the other panels that talked about, having this is the most efficient portfolio ever, but if it's not one that they can live with and they're going to blow up at the wrong time, it's arguably a worse outcome if they're not able to sustain those investments over time. And so, organizing something from a tax efficient perspective is one thing. Organizing it from a behaviorally adjusted type perspective is quite another thing. And so, I'm sure we'll have opportunities to describe, some of the difference in terms of pursuing the most tax-efficient way possible, but also creating a portfolio of investments and income that also meet some of those behavioral objectives as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I would make the point that I remember back in the, well, I don't remember, I'm told that sometime back in the early 80s, there were these partnerships you would invest in, and the whole goal, right, was to lose money. And the whole reason you wanted to do that was because the tax benefit of losing money was greater than actually making money. That doesn't exist anymore today. So if you have an investment that loses money, it's a loser. So as tax, you want to pay no taxes? Don't make money, right? It's that simple. So tax efficiency, you can't let the tax tail wag the investment dog, right? That's really the way I look at it all the time.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we look at it from a tax side in TurboTax, we're looking at balance. So when do you withdraw? When do you put in? When do you do a tax deductible Roth? I'm just going to reiterate from this morning, Roth. If you can have it, do a Roth. How to not just defer tax, but go tax-free.
Okay, so as I explained to all of you in the earlier session, I'm actually 80. So I do remember the 80s. And I recall an article in Money Magazine that interviewed 3 relatively young people about these tax write-offs. And the gist of the headline of this piece was, you can pay 0 taxes. So they interviewed them, and basically what these people would do is throughout the year, they would, every few months, look at their income and see if they had taxable income. And if they did, they'd just go buy a gas partnership, right, to lose that much money and end up paying 0. As happens with magazines, you all probably know the Sports Illustrated curse. If you show up on the cover, your career's over, and Time did this, Money did the same thing in this article, because I think about a year later they changed the tax law and you couldn't do that anymore.
You draw attention to it. Sure.
Yeah. So if you do something like that, don't tell anybody. Jeff, being 80, I grew up in a time when there weren't any Roth IRAs. In fact, through my whole career, the only, well, not the only one, but I could only get traditional IRAs, traditional 401ks,
sure,
etc. So readers, people read my blog, and I don't want to inject theretirementcafe.com here, but people who read my blog frequently say, if I have a choice, as you 80-year-olds didn't, then should I invest in a Roth or should I invest in a traditional IRA?
It's a good question. I'm sure there are lots of answers at retirementcafe.com. That's what it was, right?
The retirementcafe.com?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So it's a great question. And really it comes down to the one thing that we all know, but is really hard to predict, right, is when will your tax rate be lowest? That's the name of the game, is pay tax when your rate is the lowest. But unfortunately, we don't have that crystal ball. I think it was earlier, the discussion with Jamie, et cetera, they were talking about where you just don't know how long you're going to live, right? We can, in fact, I think it was you who mentioned that, we can run these Monte Carlo simulations ad nauseum, but which path are you going to be the one who takes? And so it's the same with taxes. And so I think one of the things we can do is look at Roth IRAs, Roth 401ks in a little different frame of light sometimes. For instance, somebody mentioned homeowners insurance. How many of you own a home? Just at a quick show of hands. Great. How many of you who own the home also have homeowners insurance on the home? Anybody wish for a tornado every year so that you can make good on your homeowners insurance? So you own something with the idea that you hope you don't really have to use it, but it gives you a sense of security, right? And that's, I think, one of the things a Roth IRA can do, or a Roth in general, whether it's Roth IRA, 401k, is eliminate one risk. And yeah, if you paid too much, you did, but your downside is today's rates. It's a livable trade-off. And the other thing I think that's really important is when people think about what will my future tax rate be, they look at it very myopically. It's either, well, my income will be lower, and so I will pay less tax. That could not be true for many reasons, whether it's the Social Security tax torpedo that's out there that people have talked about, or how about this? What if you're married, right? And you and your spouse, I'll just take the typical couple that's in retirement today or approaching. The man might be 2 or 3 years older on average, and on average he'll die, let's say, 4 years sooner. So just looking at averages, and again, that's not your life, but just averages, the woman in the couple will outlive the man actuarially by, let's just say, 6 or 7 years. That's 6 or 7 years where she may have all of their pension income from before, all of their IRA distributions from before, right? All of the dividends, all of the capital gains, and the higher Social Security check. But what happens? She goes from having those nice cushy joint brackets to going to the single filer brackets. So effectively what happens is her rate shoots up through the roof. Now, did their income change? Did the tax rates themselves change? No, but her personal rate did, and that's what matters. So I think we have to look at it in a wider framework.
Oh, absolutely agree. It's not just you, it's not just any single source of income. Nowadays, even Social Security, those who didn't have a chance, Social Security is not going to be enough. So now they're doing side gigs. So they're retired, but doing a side gig, and that's going to affect their tax too. So it's all about the individual and their bracket and what they need.
I'll just add one quick thing. I think people underestimate a lot the volatility of those assumptions that we always make, where people will say, hey, well, I'm going to pay a lower tax rate in the future because I'm not going to have X, Y, or Z. And the volatility and the ranges of outcomes there is something people underestimate quite a bit. And so having some options, there's a lot of value in leaving that optionality for the future by kind of diversifying some of the strategies, not only having Roth,
Sure,
but also some of the more traditional type investments as well. So.
Jeff, you mentioned the tax torpedo. I'm going to guess there are people in the room that don't know what that is. You want to speak about that for a second?
Sure. So very simply put, most people know that you can pay up to, or many people at least, know that you can pay, you can have up to 85% of your Social Security included in your taxable income. And that depends on a couple of different calculations, which we don't have to go into for today. But all you need to know is that at lower income levels, your Social Security could be entirely tax-free. At higher income levels, it's up to 50% gets thrown in on your taxable income. And then at the highest rate, it's up to 85% gets added to your tax return. So what happens at times is, you think there are cases where things are straightforward, but really nothing is straightforward when it comes to the tax code. So you might look at a situation and say, okay, I have $38,000 of taxable income this year. If I take $1,000 out of my IRA, I should add $1,000 to my taxable income, right? Because that's logical. I started with 38, I took $1,000 out, I add 1,000. And what you find is that at various income levels, what effectively happens is the taxable income doesn't go from 38,000 to 39. It goes, let's say, from 38,000 to $39,700, something along those lines. And you say, well, how can that be? What's actually happening behind the scenes is that for every $1 you're taking out of your IRA, you're now adding an additional 85 cents of Social Security as well. So this whole phenomena, if you will, of the tax torpedo can be boiled down to one sentence. It's adding more than $1 of taxable income to your return for every $1 that you actually receive. So people say, great, I'm in a 10% bracket. I say, well, that's great, but you're paying tax on $1.85 instead of $1. So you're really in an 18.5% bracket. If you could have traveled back in time and converted when you were at the 10% rate, the 12% rate of today, or even in the past at 15%, you'd say, well, I'm in a higher bracket than when I am at 10. But who cares if you're really paying that 18.5% rate?
Okay, so I'm the least qualified tax person up here. So let me ask you this question, because I think it's also complicated by the fact that at the beginning of retirement, you may find your taxes are quite low.
Sure.
Right? They were for me for a long time because I was living off savings. Very low tax rate. As I said, I only had access to a traditional IRA, right? But because my taxes were so low, I was able to convert a lot of that to Roth at no tax whatsoever, right? So then I put it in as a traditional IRA, took it out as a Roth IRA, which is the absolute best situation. But that really complicates the issue, doesn't it? Because that complicates the decision of whether you put it into an IRA or 401k.
Sure. I mean, again, so the whole framework, the number one thing that we're trying to do is pay taxes when your true rate is the lowest. So a lot of times those so-called gap years, right, between when you retire and let's say 70, when you turn on not only your Social Security, if you were fortunate enough and smart enough in some cases to be able to wait until 70 to take that Social Security, but also those required minimum distributions that, at least today, start at 70.5. So all of a sudden, you may be getting an avalanche of new income that you didn't have before. So many times, there's these artificially low income years because you're essentially living off of the money in the bank, or you may have taxable accounts where you can manage those capital gains to a large degree. And as a tax planner, or as someone who pays taxes, right, which you have to be one of the two, sometimes you're both, the low income years are a terrible thing to waste. They are a golden opportunity to pay tax at a low rate. And so to the exact point that you did, in those years, those gap years, they are optimal times in many cases to make these conversions from a traditional IRA, let's say, to a Roth IRA and fill up those low income years, being mindful of the tax rate you're at, be mindful of potentially your future tax rate, but also looking at outside things. For instance, Medicare Part B premium brackets that may cut into different tax brackets. Obviously, it's not a tax, but anything that goes up as your income goes up, to me, is a tax, right? So you have to be focused on those things as well.
So could I summarize what you're saying by saying that you shouldn't be looking at your tax situation this year, you should be looking at optimizing lifetime taxes?
That's it. It's about paying those, that's maybe about change it. It's about paying your lifetime's worth of taxes at the total lowest rate of your lifetime.
Right.
Can I add a quick thing to this?
Please.
Earlier, it was asked how many of you are financial advisors, how many of you are clients. This is really applicable to both because most planners, most financial advisors don't understand this. In fact, most of the firms that these advisors work for, you know, like the big Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, they prefer their advisors not talk about taxes at all. I mean, so if you're an advisor, raise your hand if your firm would just rather you just not talk about taxes at all. So I would argue that to be an effective advisor, you really ought to have these conversations with your clients. And for those of you who are clients that have financial advisors, these are conversations you should be having. So if your advisor doesn't have this knowledge, they should be partnering with people like Jeff, for instance, or partnering with your CPAs so that they can make these decisions effectively. It just doesn't happen enough. So I would argue that it should happen more.
Yeah. I would add, I was never an employee when I did retirement planning. I was never an employee of another company, but I had the same attitude on my own. Keeping up with taxes is really, really hard. I found that out early on. The guy who's been doing my taxes for 25 years spends his entire year studying tax law. I can't do that. So, sorry about that. I can't do that. So when I got to the tax portion of it, I brought in a tax expert. And I think if you're a retirement planner, you're not working for a company, he says be very careful about what you say about taxes. Even if you're on your own, you should find someone who is competent in the field.
And if you work for a firm that doesn't, like you're talking about taxes, really position it as tax education. It's not tax advice, it's tax education. It's like, look, we're taking on this this strategy or this implementation program. This is going to be the impact on your taxes potentially from this strategy, and that's why I'm bringing in your CPA for some of these discussions. So that's how you become an exceptional advisor there.
And I had one other thing too, is that too often people equate tax preparer with tax planner. And those two functions are dramatically different. One is looking historically and telling you what you owe. And there's nothing that they can change. They can just know the rules that exist as they are today, know what actually happened, and then try to report it in the most effective way. A tax planner looks at what is today and tries to figure out what is best in the future. And again, sometimes the same person can accomplish both of those, but there are many tax preparers who are great preparers who do not do planning, and vice versa as well. So you've got to know who you're working with and why you're working with them.
Okay, good advice. So Lisa, Jeff mentioned several times RMDs. What's an RMD and why should I care?
So RMD, required minimum distribution. So key is when you turn 70 and a half. So not many of us track when our half birthday is, but it is important to know for this. When you turn 70 and a half, you need to start taking required minimum distributions from your accounts. Now, as morbid as it seems, and I think we've talked a little bit more morbid before, it's based on your life expectancy. So if you're expected to live for 10 years, you need to take out 1/10 of your account in an RMD. There's a couple of breaks with that. My favorite is the QCD, the Qualified Charitable Deduction. If you're going to give to a charity, instead of taking that money out of savings, do it through your IRA. Give the money through your IRA. It meets the RMD and it's not taxable to you. But required minimum distributions sneak up on you. That's why all of the bridge strategies are so important. You know, what to do if I don't want to take Social Security yet. Okay, now I'm at the point where I'm taking Social Security. I've got an RMD coming up. What avenues do I have to minimize there, as I am required, again, RMD, required minimal distribution, to take that money out?
Okay. I would also point out, somewhat unrelated to taxes, is there's some research that was done by Steve Vernon at Stanford and Wade Pfau and Joe Tomlinson. And they were looking at trying to come up with a simple retirement strategy for middle income people. I've forgotten what that was, but it was up to $1 million, maybe, or $1 million and less, 100,000 to $1 million. What could these people do if they don't want to hire a planner and they just want to take the simplest approach to it? And it's really kind of interesting because they're trying to come up with the simplest approach, and they came up with 3 or 4 steps, in the report that they generated is like 350 pages. So read the summary. But my point is, that when they got to the spending part, estimating how much it's safe to spend, they went with the IRS RMD calculation. And the reason they did that is because there are lots of calculations that do that. And you don't have to just, apply it to your IRAs. Well, you have to apply it to your IRAs because the IRS requires you to. But you can also use that same figure to calculate what might be a budgetary spending amount. And so in looking at all those strategies, they said, well, the simplest way to do it is just pretend you have an RMD and for your taxable accounts as well. The one issue with that is that RMDs start at 70 and a half, and you might want to use this plan at 65, so they actually figured out a way for you to calculate a RMD for those years as well. So I highly recommend that report. Interesting to me because these spending rules like RMD or using consumption smoothing or 4% rules and all those sort of things, those are budgetary numbers. No one can calculate, without knowing your future tax returns, your future portfolio returns, your future life expectancy, future expenses. No one can tell you what a safe amount to spend is. So in that case, we can't argue that one of these methods is better than the other. So RMD is probably as good as the others. But I would encourage you, if you're interested in that, I'll look up the research. Again, the authors were Steve Vernon, Joe Tomlinson, and Wade Pfau. So Devin, what are the common mistakes when retirees or planners do decide they want both an effective and tax-efficient portfolio? What are the common mistakes they make in putting that together?
That's a great question. So our organization works with advisors all over the country, and typically on the higher end, the high net worth, ultra high net worth type families and individuals. And the one thing that kind of consistently comes through for me as a mistake that they always kind of are self-aware of is that clients underestimate the longevity issue. They underestimate how long their time horizon is when they retire. Because when you're in the accumulation mode, retirement's always so far away. And then when retirement, there's just a different mindset that, oh, well, I'm entering into, the last part of my life. Well, that last part of your life is still 30, 40 years, almost as much time as you spent accumulating, if not more. And so the temptation is to say, look, I'm going to put all of my assets into these, very tax efficient, expecting this income. I've got to maximize my income side of the equation from a tax perspective, and they ignore some potential opportunities to defer those taxes for 20, 30, 40 years. And that leverage of deferring those taxes for so long from an investment portfolio perspective can outweigh any kind of short-term planning benefits that you might achieve in the shorter term. So underestimating that time horizon, I think, is a big deal. So it allows you some freedom to choose investments that have different exposure than just stocks and bonds, maybe are not as tax efficient from an income perspective in the short term, but the ability to defer those taxes longer term moves the needle a lot more. So that's a big mistake that I see quite a bit.
Okay. Jeff, almost every retirement planner will stake out a position on asset allocation, right? How much you have in stocks, how much you have in bonds, and how much you have small cap. There's another issue which is referred to as asset location, right? Which means, do I put this particular asset in a taxable account? Do I put it into a tax-deferred or a tax-free account? And then I think there are probably issues with how you withdraw those. So could you comment on that?
Sure. So I think the first part you mentioned is true, right? Most people have at least done some work to figure out, should I own, a balanced portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% bonds, or is it 70-30 or whatnot? And I think of that as the basic question that people have to answer in their retirement, right? And from an investment point of view, I think there are three key questions. The first is, what do I own, right? Which is, again, stocks, bonds, real estate, cash. I think that second question then, which not as many people get to, but still a good amount, is how should I own that investment? So for argument's sake, if you want to own real estate, you could go buy the Vanguard 500 REIT. You could go find a partnership that you could buy into. You could walk next door to your next door neighbor and say, I've got to make you an offer that you can't refuse. I'd like to buy your house and rent it out. All of those are ways of owning real estate in your portfolio, and they have very different tax consequences to them depending upon how you own them. For instance, you're not really getting depreciation per se actively if you own like a Vanguard REIT, right? But if you buy the building next door and rent it out, you might have substantial losses for the first few years, at least on paper, thanks to that depreciation element. And so that's the second question is, again, first is what, second is how, and then the last one is, where do you own it? And if you've done some of that, as Devin talked about, having, let's say a little bit in taxable money, a little bit in tax-deferred money, a little bit in tax-free money, or maybe just two of the three. If you have anything more than just one type of money, then the question becomes, I have my asset allocation pie, right, that you're all familiar with. And then I have my asset location pie, which is how much of my accounts are taxable, tax-free, tax-deferred, etc. And then the question becomes, how do I take these two pies and overlay them on top of one another, right? Where does the stock go? Does it go in my traditional IRA? Does it go in my Roth IRA? If I own real estate, am I putting that in my taxable account, or does it go in a self-directed IRA? So that's that third question, and very few people actively do that. Very few firms actively look at tax location, and there's a real value to that. And unfortunately, a lot of people who do look at tax location don't really understand the environment we're currently in. For instance, how many of you have heard something like this? Don't put your bonds, don't put your stocks inside your IRA because you're going to take what will be qualified dividends and capital gains and turn it into ordinary income when you take it out. Better to put your bonds in there that are ordinary income, right? How many of you have heard something like that? That sounds great, right? The reality is, if you look at the research that's looking at today's rates, it's probably the opposite. Even though you're taking long-term capital gains income and turning it into ordinary income, remember the power of the IRA is in what? Deferral. What are you deferring on bonds today? It's peanuts. It's nothing. There's nothing to defer. You're not making enough income. I know we're not at 2000 and maybe 11 rates, but we're certainly not at historical norms or anywhere close. And so today, if you have any sort of turnover in your portfolio, even a very modest amount, 10, 20%, in many instances, you're still better off putting your stock inside your traditional account and paying ordinary income tax on your bond income that's in your taxable, which is contrary to the way most people think. So it's answering those three questions. What do you own? How do you own it? Where do you own it? And then it's answering them correctly.
Where would you put cash?
Most of the time, it's going to be in your taxable account. That's probably, so essentially what happens is you create the best way to do this is to create an ordering system. And you just go and you rank your investments from most efficient tax-wise to least efficient tax-wise. You know, cash inside a taxable account has a very minimal impact, right? Because there's not much else going on. But if you tell me, you know, I only have traditional IRAs and Roth IRAs because during my working years, well, it's going to go in your traditional IRA. So it goes, everybody's situation is very different, but in general, you want to have obviously your growthiest growth investments inside your Roth IRA. It's kind of a standard frame of reference because if you're going to have growth, it might as well be tax-free growth. And then as far as your other assets, you just want to rank them in order. And part of that could be the turnover that you have. Part of it is the actual investment. Remember we said, how do you own it? Well, you can own the S&P 500 ETF, very low turnover, right? Very tax efficient if you're just holding that. Might be something I hold in my taxable account. If I'm a believer more in active management and I want to have the large US caps, large cap US market, but I'm owning it in an active manager who in a mutual fund turns over that portfolio quite a bit each year, and therefore I have a lot of capital gains distributions potentially, well, that I might want to shift inside my traditional IRA, even though they're essentially the same asset. So you can't answer question 3, where do I own it, until you answer question 1, what do I own, and 2, how do I own it?
Okay. At least I'm wondering if from a TurboTax kind of perspective, you might have other considerations for withdrawing.
So basically, when it does come down to where it is, when it is, the only thing I would add is the one we don't talk about, and that's inheritance. So with a lot of these vehicles, you also need to look at, am I planning for this to be an inheritance also? So you need to take a little bit of that into account as to where it's going to go to make sure that your estate is actually maximized also, that you're taking advantage of that. You had mentioned buying real estate. So is that piece of real estate going to be my retirement income generator and turn around and go to my kids? In which case, it's a great to keep in your cash account, because then you're going to get the advantage now. You're going to have a little bit of income, and then your kids will get it at a bumped up basis. So it is all about watching it across the board. Unfortunately, with TurboTax, we don't get to go into what are you going to do next year. We do give you some advice like, hey, do you know you could have put into an IRA, especially right around this time of year, because you can actually put into your IRA up to April 15th. Yeah. So if you can take advantage, it is the take advantage of putting into a Roth right now. If your income is going to allow you to do that, go for it. And things like putting into a traditional, if it's going to lower your taxes, if it's brought you up to a point where you may be even getting double benefits. So things like I'm going to go with, you have self-employed income. Sure. There's a new deduction this year, qualified business income deduction, and it's based on what your income level is. If your income level is too high, but it would help to put into a SEP and maximize it, brings your income down, allows you for another deduction. There's multiple ways that you can impact your tax return with what your investments are for retirement.
You know, I was just going to add, it's interesting that you mentioned the inheritance angle, because that also changes the equation sometimes. So we talked about paying tax at the lowest rate. Well, sometimes it's not even just your lifetime. I have to amend my statement even further. Sometimes it's over the family's lifetime. I could think of a great example. A few years ago, I was working with an individual, and one of the things we did was we converted because he was retired. He was in a pretty, it was a good tax bracket. It was in the upper 20s, but his kids were all doctors and lawyers and very successful. He says, I'm going to leave it to them. They're going to lose half of it to income taxes at the federal level. So he ended up converting during his lifetime because he really didn't need the money. It was largely going to go to them. And then I remember a very similar situation with someone else, and he said, I'm not converting. When my kids get this, my kids are dunces. They don't make any money, so let them take it out at their tax rate. And so, it's the same type of thing, looking at not just today's tax rate, but, whenever that tax gets paid, what is the rate at that time, which could essentially, as you pointed out, be beyond your own lifetime.
Okay, so if I put those two things together, let me ask you about this scenario. Let's say I'm like 80 years old. So I have a lot of stocks I've owned for 100 years. Mm-hmm. And the gains on them are quite high because I've owned them for 100 years. So should I put that in a tax deferred account to defer those taxes, or should I just say, you know, I don't think I'm ever going to spend these. I'm going to leave them to my kids and they'll get a stepped up basis. So should I then leave them in a taxable account?
So what you're asking is, Jeff, I've done things backwards for all of these years.
Right.
Now what do I do, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. So in that particular case, you know, you've got to work with what's in front of you.
Right.
Probably doesn't make sense to you know, to sell all those stocks, replace them with cash or bonds, and then to repurchase them inside the traditional IRA. But it does make sense to actively look and say, hey, I've got $20,000 of losses this year from these positions. Let me sell $20,000 worth of gain of the investment and pare that down. And to that, and looking even further, for instance, you mentioned looking at qualified charitable distributions, which I'm a huge fan of. The only thing that may be better than a qualified charitable distribution is giving appreciated stock away, because you're getting even a third tax benefit for it. So if I can give that, and I don't know about you, you probably have the data on this.
Oh, yes.
Everybody is charitably inclined when it comes to their tax return, right?
Absolutely.
I've never seen a tax return go out without someone being very charitably inclined. So you know, if you're going to give to charity, you might as well do it in a tax efficient way. And if I give, let's say, $10,000 to charity via this highly appreciated stock I own for the last 50 years, I can now take $10,000 that was in my IRA, buy the same stock, I have the same asset allocation, but it didn't cost me anything to make that transfer. So you're not going to be able to make wholesale changes, but you can start to gradually, you know, shift that over time.
So I assume, as you said, I made the mistake of doing everything backwards over all these years, but I assume the really big problem that I have is that I bought stocks that have increased in value tremendously. So now I have a capital gains problem.
It's a very
That's
bourgeois
not the problem.
Yeah, very bourgeois problem.
Okay, just checking. Folks, if you buy stocks and you just hang on to them, by the time you're 80, you'll be great. So I'm going to kind of throw this question out to all three of you. But part of this issue, as we've kind of discussed, is Social Security benefits, the tax implications of those. How do we maximize Social Security benefits? And I'm going to throw this out to all of you, but how do we maximize Social Security benefits from a tax perspective?
Well, I'll start, and I'm not a CPA, and in fact, I'm probably the least tax-aware person. My background's really more from an investment perspective, but I understand the basics of Social Security, which is, you know, to maximize Social Security in terms of your benefit, it's better to claim those benefits later and later, right? And so it's important from an investment perspective to understand the timing of your, you know, your retirement and your, you know, potential liquidity events if you're a business owner and things like that, and bridging that gap between, you know, that time and when it's you know, most optimal to take your Social Security benefit. So there's quite a bit of planning packed into that small gap period from an investment perspective. And I was going to mention earlier when the conversation was happening around the vehicles, you know, some of the new options. I think you'd be surprised at the amount of new vehicles that are out there, investment vehicles that you know, that were traditionally only available for institutional investors, but are now available for retail investors. And so you can really optimize your portfolio using some of those vehicles. You know, even for investments like private equity and things like that, things that were really out of reach before for retail investors, but are now in reach now. And so your advisor is sort of making those portfolio optimization adjustments so that you can help bridge that gap between when you're taking your own money versus when you're bringing those Social Security benefits. Okay. So that's just only one angle of that.
For me, it is truly all about that gap and maximizing. The other thing that we've found interesting at TurboTax is people are retiring later and later. So you may be in your 70s and still working full time, in which case that also pushes going into Social Security later. And you're putting more and more in. So it's an interesting concept of maximizing and retiring. Again, we're living so much longer. As a tax preparer, for those of you who know tax preparers and have like CPAs that are in their 80s, we never retire. we just leave one job and do tax prep the rest of our lives. So there's whole strategies around that. So you may be retired, but then what are you going to do in your retired life? So it's how much income do you have, how long can you push off getting Social Security?
Sure. I think there's also important to remember that built-in tax efficiency of Social Security itself. Remember, we talked about it before. We said in a worst-case scenario, up to 85 cents of every dollar of Social Security is taxable. But that also means, at a worst-case scenario, 15 cents of every dollar of Social Security you receive is tax-free. And look at your other sources of income. For instance, your traditional IRA. When you take $1 out of your IRA, isn't usually $1 of it taxable? When you take $1 of interest, the whole dollar is taxable. Think of what you could have done with your lifetime's earnings. You know, that's another thing to consider, right? If we have a ordinary interest item, like $1 of interest, it's fully taxable. Think of what you could have done in your life if 15% of every check you had received had been given to you tax-free. Think of how much more you'd have today. And those Social Security calculators that do all those, they're great for information purposes. But a lot of times, at least many of the practitioners, at least that are in here, they probably get what I refer to as the stupid question from clients. Very nice way of sugarcoating that. It's a really dumb question. It goes something like this. If I wait till 70, how long do I have to live to
break even?
That's right. It's a terrible question. We already discussed that, right? You all have homes. You don't hope to break even on your homeowner's insurance. Nobody drove here this morning and said, boy, I hope I get hit by a car so that I can make good on my car. The goal is not to break even. Social Security is a longevity insurance. What happens if you die at 71? That's the question. Well, what if I die? Congratulations, you didn't run out of money. Good job. Right? That's not the issue. The issue is, what if you live until 100? What if you live until 98, 97, somewhere in that range? And again, if you think of it that way, Social Security may be the greatest form of income there is. It's guaranteed, which I know we can argue, and we can argue in breaks, but I think those of you that are close to retirement have nothing to worry about with changes. And if you're a cynical jerk like me, and you say politicians are only out for themselves, well, you know what they're not going to do? They're not going to tick off the one group of voters who go out and vote in the greatest numbers, which are retirees, right? Next to the NRA, the AARP is like the most powerful lobby in Washington. You know, the change right now from 66 to 67 that's going on for many of you that are retiring now. Do you know when that change took place, when the law created that change? That's right. It was the year I was born, 1983.
I knew that.
And now it's first impacting people. So they give people a long window. So Social Security, if you want more, we can argue this in the break, but it's guaranteed. It's cost of living adjusted, right? How many of your clients' pensions do that? Very few. And it's tax efficient. What else does that? And by the way, there's no penalty if you're married to someone 20 or 30 years younger and they pick up your higher check when you die at 95 and they pick it up at 65 or whatever. They step into your higher check. If you were married and you did that with a pension at work, your pension will be marginalized, right? So it's the greatest stream of income for many people that you might have. May not be the biggest, but it's the best.
Thanks. Yeah.
I like that.
Jim, one of the questions that is frequently asked at my blog by readers is, what do you mean by optimizing Social Security benefits? And here's the thing. You said, I think it was Lisa who said, optimize them. Well, if you live to a long time, then waiting to 70 is optimal. If you live 4 more years, it's not optimal. You should have claimed, right? Now, we don't know when that's going to be. But this really confuses the typical retirement client out there. So could you just speak on that just a little bit and define what you mean by optimal and why you think that waiting is optimal?
I don't think that everybody should wait, right? There's definitely circumstances where people should take it sooner. But I think last statistic I saw, I think it was 2% of men and 4% of women are waiting till 70. I don't know what the right percentage is. I just know that's not it. right? It's not 2% and 4% or anywhere even close to that. Again, because of all those benefits. And people look and they say, well, that means I can't spend as much. No, that's not the right view. Even with things like qualified longevity annuity contracts or guaranteed sources of income, people look and say, well, if I take a big chunk out of my portfolio now, that means I spend less. And that's not necessarily the case. If you know, for argument's sake, that if you live to 70, you get a nice big influx of income, and then maybe you live till 80 or 85 or 90, and another stream of income keeps coming in after that, you can spend everything today. Part of the issue is that you have to keep a reserve, right? Because you don't know how long you're going to live. If you know that you're going to die at 85, if you could put a crystal ball in front of you or a magic hat, whatever you want to call it, and you could say, I'm going to die at 85 and 240 days. Well, I can tell you the day that you should take Social Security, right? And the day that you should do everything else, but we don't know that. And so with that in mind, you have to buffer enough aside that what if I live to 86? What if I live to 96? If you're covered with that, let's just say hypothetically, I could give you, and you need to spend $100,000 a year cost of living adjusted, and I could somehow magically give you that cost of living adjusted $100,000 of income at 85. And no matter how long you live, whether you die at 86 or you die at 186 like Methuselah, you're going to have this cost of living adjusted income. It means that even though I don't know how long you'll live, for planning, I know how long you're going to live. You're going to live to be 85. I can spend through all your money, and if you live to 186, I'm still covered. So the optimal amount of Social Security, you're right, for dollars and cents, we can never say until you're dead whether it was the right move. Or if you live to be 90, we can say in retrospect, yeah, this was good or bad. But for when we're actually doing the planning, which is when it matters, we have to look at the what ifs. And for most people, the bigger risk is, if I live to be 95, will I run out of money? Not, if I die at 71, could I have left a little bit more to my kids by taking Social Security at a different age?
Right. So rather than the advice I usually give, rather than you should claim at 70, because there are a lot of people who need the money and they can't wait. So the advice I generally give is you should delay as long as you're able to. Would you agree with that?
I would.
Okay. Okay.
There's actually a lot of
You're
research.
the moderator, I have to.
There's a lot of research behind that that essentially comes to the same conclusion, albeit in different pathways. That pushing it out farther is to your ability to do so is the thing. If you're just in really poor health, or if you just simply cannot wait because for whatever reasons you haven't planned for that gap perspective, but especially if you're in poor health, those would be the reasons that you take it. And that's all that research that's been done a million times over is kind of that's really boils down into a rare rule of thumb, that can be pretty reliable.
It's really just the cheapest way to buy longevity insurance, isn't it?
It is. There's studies out there on that. That is the cheapest. It's the cheapest annuity you can buy. See, sometimes people come into the office like, oh, I own this annuity, and I took my Social Security at 62. What are you doing? Social Security is a cheaper annuity. It's the cheapest annuity you can buy, especially in low interest rate environments, again, which we're still in.
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. Anyone?
If you take the Medicare health insurance, do you have to take the Social Security number? In other words, when you turn 65, if you want to go on Medicare Part B and have that as your health insurance, can you still delay your taking of the money till 70?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're not linked.
They're not linked. No, if you're on Social Security, you'll generally automatically be enrolled in Medicare. But if you're not, you can apply only for Medicare, and then you can delay your Social Security.
And the second question, that example you gave about the doctor's kids not wanting to get the taxed, aren't they subject to the $4 million exemption for the husband and the wife with inheritance tax, federal? So they wouldn't have had
estate tax
anyway.
You're talking about at the state level or at the federal level?
I guess federal.
So federal.
He didn't
okay.
do it was because he didn't want his kids to have to pay taxes because they're doctors. But wouldn't they have been exempt anyway for up to $8 million?
I'm talking about income taxes, not the estate taxes. Not the estate tax. Yeah, and for today, it's actually 12.4 million,
right.
and then, or excuse me, 11.4 million, and then you also have the portability element of that. So effectively, you can have like $24 million protected, or $23 million. So very, very few estates this year are subject to that. In fact, estate planning today is far more about managing the income tax around death than it is managing the estate tax.
That the kids would have to pay.
That's exactly right.
Right.
Correct.
Thank you.